Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carolyn McCollum, and I'm the co-chair of the Library Lecture Series, and I would like to welcome you all to today's lecture. Our guest speaker is Steve Jarrett, who is the Director of Media Facilities in the Communication Department. Steve has worked at Wake Forest for 15 years. He received his BA in Radio, Television, and Motion Pictures from Chapel Hill, and his master's in Communication and Theater with a concentration in Broadcasting and Cinema from UNCG. He has taught courses in cinema for UNCG, High Point University, Piedmont Community College, North Carolina School of the Arts, School of Filmmaking, and Wake Forest. He has co-authored 2 articles with Mary Dalton of the Communication Department, and those were published in Creative Screenwriting magazine. Between 1991 and 2005, he published a weekly column on older films available on home video called Vintage Video, which ran in the Hickory Daily Record and the Greensboro News and Record. In regard to the library's auditorium, Steve was on the initial planning committee for this wonderful venue. His expertise in space design and media equipment proved invaluable to the creation of this facility. Without further ado, Steve Jarrett.
How many of you are here only because of the poster? Waiting for my head to burst into flames. That was pretty impressive. Not going to happen.
Everybody gets something to leave.
Right. Yeah. It's all over. So, one way or another, considerations of the horror film genre usually begin with some variation on the same question. So let's get it out of the way right away. And that is this: why would anyone pay good money to have the bejesus scared out? Why would anyone do that? After all, people do it all the time, and not just in October, you know, when people stand in line to walk through haunted house attractions. You know, people stand in even longer lines, pay even more money to go on roller coaster rides and amusement parks and come away bitterly disappointed if they've not been scared senseless by the experience. And of course, people do stand in line and buy tickets to see horror movies. Why? One answer might have to do with the practical value of rehearsing, so to speak, our responses to mortal dreads in the absence of actual peril. This is similar to the value of play for young animals. Lion cubs, for example, may be observed in the wild, play fighting with their siblings. It may seem idle, but the fact is that the young lions are developing the skills that will ensure their survival as adults. After all, if play were truly idle, it seems fairly certain that the behavior would have been extinguished by evolution long ago. But the fact is that a cub who does not engage in play fighting will be a less accomplished hunter, therefore less likely to live long enough to produce offspring. Another answer might lie in the Aristotelian notion of catharsis. By experiencing fear without being subjected to actual danger, we're permitted to purge ourselves temporarily of our mortal dreads. But the catharsis of the roller coaster ride is not really an Aristotelian catharsis. In his Poetics, Aristotle was talking about narrative. With that in mind, the question of why we want to be scared is to an extent beside the point. It presumes that being scared is our only motivation for seeing horror movies. In fact, these films are works of art, and as such, transcend transcend mere utilitarian purposes. Granted, they may be bad art. Indeed, they often are. The lesser examples of the form have undoubtedly been responsible for the critical disdain that has been regularly visited on the genre and on genre films in general. In this connection, however, it's important to remember Sturgeon's law. Theodore Sturgeon was a writer who specialized in science fiction and fantasy. And on one occasion, he was engaged in a friendly debate with a mainstream writer who chided him for, as he would have it, wasting his talents in the literary ghetto of science fiction. At one point, the mainstream writer said, "After all, you must admit that 90% of all science fiction is unmitigated crap." Well, Sturgeon thought about that for a minute, and then he replied, "Yes, but 90% of everything is crap. 90% of all plays are crap. 90% of all novels are crap. 90% of all poems. 90% of all music is crap." Well, thus was born what has come to be known as Sturgeon's law. 90% of everything is crap. The point, of course, is that an art form deserves to be judged by the 10% that is not crap, not by the 90%. Poetry deserves to be judged by Shakespeare's sonnets, not by Hallmark reading cards. Music deserves to be judged by Mozart, not by Muzak. And horror films, horror films deserve to be judged by The Shining, not by blood-sucking freaks. To consider the horror film, one must first consider the medium in which it is situated. The cinema is an infant, as art forms go, barely a century old. But its conceptual roots may be found in antiquity. Consider, for example, the striking similarities between Plato's cave and the cinema experience. Plato, you'll recall, imagined a group of people in a cave watching a wall on which shadows are cast by puppeteers behind them. In Plato's image, the people are unable to get up, unable even to look around, and they therefore imagine the shadows to be all that exists. Plato then poses a what-if question. What if, he asks, one of these people were to be liberated from the cave and taken out into the sunlight? The resulting enlightenment, both literal and figurative, represents philosophical enlightenment, using the mind to penetrate the veil of surface perceptions to understand what underlies those perceptions, or more precisely, to see beyond particularity to abstraction, or what Plato called forms. To bring the image back around to cinema, however, we must add another what-if question to Plato's. What if, having been liberated from the cave, we then chose to occasionally return to the cave? Not to return to the original state of ignorance of the larger world outside the cave, to be sure, but for other reasons, aesthetic reasons. This return to the cave would be undertaken willingly and in the full knowledge that the shadows are not all there is. One's tempted to say, in the knowledge that the shadows are not real, but that wouldn't be accurate. The shadows are real. The error of Plato's cave dwellers is not that they believe the shadows to be real, but that they believe the shadows to be all there is. When we've been enlightened and no longer believe the reality of the shadows to be plenary, we may still find meaning in them through, in Coleridge's phrase, the willing suspension of that disbelief. In an aesthetic context, we may discover that the shadows, which do not have substance, might transcend substance, so as to enlighten us in other ways. The insubstantial shadows on the cave wall may be a poor substitute for the direct experience of the world outside. But on the other hand, the very fact of their gossamer intangibility makes them useful as blank slates on which to project metaphors. The willing and enlightened return to Plato's cave, therefore, entails inviting Plato's puppeteers to move from being deceivers to being interpreters, to become artists. The creation of art out of dancing shadows on a wall is the essence of what we call cinema. It's a striking sort of art form, in that it is normally viewed in a way that approximates the dream state. We're in the dark and in a self-imposed state of partial sensory deprivation, concentrating exclusively on sight and hearing. Ingmar Bergman described it this way: no other art medium, neither painting nor poetry, can communicate the specific quality of the dream as well as film can. When the lights go down in the cinema and this white shining point opens up for us, our gaze stops flitting hither and thither, settles, and becomes quite steady. We're drawn into a course of events. We are participants in a dream. This may well be as close as we can come to being in the dream state while still fully awake. Filmmakers can therefore inscribe dreams into their dancing shadows. And by evoking a waking dream state, they can represent the real world in a heightened way. Cinema situates its art in the landscape of our dreams. It is therefore only fitting that some of those dreams should be nightmares. When I recently presented a course for the MALS program here on campus on the horror film genre, I called it Nightmare Cinema. That was not intended as an idle turn of phrase. I believe that many of the films belonging to what we call the horror genre really do constitute the shared nightmares of our culture. Now, I hedge by saying many, because the phrase horror genre is employed very broadly to describe a wide variety of films, from those that are grounded in fantasy to those that merely exaggerate some of the grislier aspects of the real world. To my mind, however, it is the horror films that are fantasy-based that hold the greatest fascination. It may well be that a case can be made for including the various forms of what I would call torture porn within the definition of horror film, but I confess that it is a precinct of the genre's territory that I generally don't care to visit. An aspect of the fantasy-based horror film that I want to focus on today is informed by Freud's concept of the uncanny. Now, having compared cinema to the dream state, you must have known that a Freud reference couldn't be far beyond. Although uncanny is the standard English translation, it's more profitable to consider the word that Freud actually used, which was unheimlich. Now, unheimlich does not refer to the refusal to assist a choking victim. Instead, it results from applying a negating prefix to the word heimlich, which means familiar and comfortable. We can see in the beginning of the word a cognate of our word home, which can also be seen in the word Heimat, which means homeland. The Heimlich, then, is that with which we feel at home. Unheimlich, therefore, refers to the opposite, those things that make us uncomfortable, uneasy, disturbed. But Heimlich also has a second meaning, referring to concealment. A heimlich act is one performed in secret. Freud points out that the reconciliation of these two meanings in the term unheimlich, as he uses it, is to be found in Schelling's remark that the uncanny consists of that which ought to have remained hidden in secret and yet came to light. It's not difficult to see why Freud pounced on Schelling's phrasing. One of the cornerstones of Freud's psychoanalytic theory, of course, is repression. The sense of the uncanny occurs then, according to Freud, when that which is familiar but repressed is brought to light, causing uneasiness and ultimately fear. This is distinct from something overtly horrific, like a hulking and ferocious monster which would inspire fear in anyone. The uncanny inspires fear in the individual for whom it is most familiar. And what is more familiar, more heimlich, than our own likeness? The use of a character's double in the narrative tradition is usually designated with the German word Doppelgänger, which translates as double goer, or more accurately, double walker, since the verb to go in German also means to walk. The term was originated by Paul Friedrich Richter, writing under his pseudonym Jean Paul in his 1796 novel Siebenkäse, and has been applied broadly to the concept of the double ever since. In fact, it's been applied rather too broadly, referring to everything from comic conceits based on mistaken identity, to formal counterparts sharing no actual common identity, to characters with multiple personality disorder. In considering the doppelganger, it is therefore important to specify what one does not mean. Now, despite my invocation of Freud's name, I do not mean to consider here real-life psychological conditions, such as the various forms of dissociative disorder, or what are called autoscopic phenomena. I'm also not referring to stories about twins, in the usual sense, anyway, or unrelated persons who happen to look alike, as in The Prince and the Pauper, or Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay. Nothing, in fact, that can be found in the objective world of real life. I'm also not referring to the concept of soulmates, two people who are in effect incomplete unless and until they can be joined to their missing other half. No, what I'm considering here are the doubles that spring from our nightmares and haunt our movies, typically supernatural and always uncanny. This is the strain of doppelganger fiction that informs the horror film genre. A seminal early example is The Student of Prague, made not once but twice by German filmmakers, once in 1913 and once in 1926. This is a loose adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's short story, William Wilson. The title character, an impoverished student named Baldwin, makes a Faustian bargain with a Mephistopheles-like character called Scapinelli. In return for bestowing vast riches, Scapinelli requires only that he be permitted to take from Baldwin's Spartan living quarters any one item of his choosing. As the penniless Baldwin owns nothing of real value, this seems like an advantageous bargain. The deal is closed, the money given, and then Scapinelli takes in return Baldwin's reflection from his mirror. The reflection, liberated from the mirror, takes on an independent existence as Baldwin's doppelgänger. To Baldwin's dismay, he soon finds his good name ruined by the actions of his double. And when he confronts the doppelgänger and destroys it, the result is that his own life is forfeited. This is typical of this sort of doppelgänger narrative. The destruction of the protagonist's double takes the life of the protagonist as well, suggesting that the separate existence of the two is fundamentally illusory. In this case, it's as if, having been seduced into believing that Baldwin's reflection could be removed from the mirror and given an independent existence, the conclusion brings us back around to reality again. If one kills the person one sees in the mirror, then of course it follows that one has taken one's own life. A variation on the idea of the incarnated mirror image from the student of Prague is the Jekyll and Hyde story, in which the individual periodically undergoes a transformation into his alter ego, so that only one is incarnated at a time, thereby precluding a face-to-face showdown, as in Student of Prague. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has been adapted for the screen more than 20 times. And that's just counting the versions that actually use the character names Jekyll and Hyde. If you include films that are based on variations of the story, as for example, Jerry Lewis's The Nutty Professor, the quantity escalates geometrically. Clearly, this is a story that touches a nerve with us. One common variant on the Jekyll and Hyde narrative is to combine it with the shapeshifter trope in the form of a werewolf film. The Wolfman, released by Universal Pictures, as part of its famous horror film cycle of the 30s and 40s, is a seminal example of this take on the werewolf story. Its protagonist, Lawrence Talbot, played by Lon Chaney Jr., knows that he becomes a menace when the moon is full, and is therefore tormented by guilt, but he's unable to do anything about it. One can scarcely imagine a more straightforward representation of Freud's conception of the troublesome id in our ongoing struggle to manage and control it. The B-movie boom of the 1950s, fueled by the prominence of drive-ins and their largely youthful audiences, produced another interesting variation. I Was a Teenage Werewolf. This low-budget quickie starred a young man named Michael Landon, who I believe went on to do some television work, if memory serves. The film itself is no masterpiece, to be sure. It belongs to Theodore Sturgeon's 90%. But its premise, I think, shows a kind of brilliance. Who, I ask you, could a teenage audience better relate to than a character who suddenly sprouts hair where there's never been hair before, and who periodically turns into a snarling antisocial beast? Say what you like about those 50s B movies, they knew their audience. There's also some variations on the doppelganger theme that are subtler, less straightforward than an incarnated mirror image or a transformation of the protagonist into an alter ego. Consider Frankenstein, for example. Victor Frankenstein, whose name was changed to Henry in Universal's 1931 adaptation with Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, does not transform into a monster. Instead, godlike, he creates a man in his own image. His creation is the incarnation of his hubris, which he subsequently tries to disown, thereby ultimately bringing about his own downfall. Director James Whale and screenwriter John Balderston acknowledged the identification between Frankenstein and his creation in Frankenstein and its sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein. You may be familiar with the famous creation sequence from Frankenstein, in which the movement of the creature's hand induces Frankenstein to exult in his success by repeatedly exclaiming, "It's alive." Now watch in the sequel how it's revealed that Frankenstein, who is thought to have died at the hands of his creation in the previous film, still retains a flicker of life. You'll note that Frankenstein's original hysterical reaction is sardonically mocked by assigning its echo to the squeegee-voiced Minnie, a domestic servant who provides much of the film's comic relief.
Speak to me, Henry. Oh, my lady, you'll never speak again. I was foretold. I was told to wear my wedding ring.
Once again, we see the tentative motion of a hand that had been pronounced dead, prompting the cry of, "He's alive." Another example. In Frankenstein, Henry begins his attempt to communicate with his creation with a simple verbal command.
Sit down. Go and sit down.
In The Bride of Frankenstein, the tables are turned. Frankenstein is confronted by the creature he has sought first to disown and then to kill. In the interim, his creation has acquired the ability to speak. Notice the first thing the creature says to his creator.
Sit down.
No less than our image in a mirror, that which we create is a reflection of us. When it is endowed through the lens of fantasy with the ability to physically dog our footsteps and interrogate us face to face, it becomes a kind of doppelgänger. Earlier I mentioned that I would not be considering stories about soulmates who complete one another, but there is an acknowledged horror classic that wrings a perverse change on that sentimental conceit, twisting it into a nightmarish variation. The visionary German filmmaker F.W. Murnau adapted Bram Stoker's novel Dracula for the screen in 1922 under the title Nosferatu. The adaptation was done without the permission of the Stoker estate, and so as a legal fig leaf, the title and the character names were changed. The protagonist is called Hutter. Although a married man, emotionally, Hutter is still a child. His wife, Ellen, is by far the more mature of the two. Hutter, it seems, is immature sexually as well as emotionally. The film tells us subtly but firmly that the marriage has not been consummated. I should mention here that vampire stories are almost always about sex, one way or another. In fact, many vampires are portrayed as suave lounge lizard types and are shown preying on their victims in a manner that is as much seduction as assault. Whereas a rapist may forcibly infuse the victim with a vital fluid, the vampire, in an inversion of this process, withdraws from the victim the vital fluid. But it's still a rape. When Hutter travels to the Carpathian Mountains to close a real estate deal, he encounters Count Orlok, the film's version of Count Dracula. Orlok is a departure from the handsome, if somewhat pallid, Count Dracula. Unlike many screen vampires, Orlok looks like what a vampire actually is, a reanimated corpse. He not only looks dead, he looks as if he's been dead for some time. As in the novel, when the Count happens to see a picture of Uther's wife, he is seized with an undisguised lust for her. In a subsequent scene, we see Uther being menaced by the vampire during the night. The childlike Uther reacts in a typically childlike fashion, like pulling the covers over his head. But far away, Ellen seems to be aware that her husband is in danger. We're now crosscuts between Orlok's castle and Ellen's bedroom to establish the relationship. The natural assumption is that Ellen has some kind of psychic link to her husband. But watch how we're now undercuts that assumption with this framing and editing. When Ellen calls out, it is Orlok who reacts. Look at the eye lines. That's exactly the way such a scene would be framed and edited if Orlok and Ellen were in the same room, not hundreds of miles apart. Watch how it plays out in the full scene. Watch these next two cuts. Exactly the way it would be done if they were in the same room together. The connection here is clearly not between Ellen and Uther. but between Ellen and Orlok. It is as if Orlok represents the sexual maturity that Putter lacks, thereby permitting Orlok to share in the psychic connection that Ellen feels with her husband. Another scene later in the film seems to similarly undermine Ellen's emotional link with Putter in favor of her link with Orlok. Both Putter and Orlok are traveling to Bremen, where Ellen waits, one traveling overland and one by sea. This image shows Ellen gazing out to sea, awaiting her husband's return. But it is Orlok who is coming by sea, and Putter who is coming by land. Orlok has, in a way, completed Putter by supplying the sexuality that Putter lacked, but it is a perverse sexuality, bound up with death, and as such, will lead to no good end. These are just a few of the many, many variations on the doppelganger theme in the horror genre. From Invasion of the Body Snatchers to The Other, to Dead Ringers, to The Dark Half, many others, the sinister double remains an enduring staple of the genre. Many reasons for this, I'm sure, but I think one of the most important relates to the fact that horror films almost always have to do, one way or another, with the concept of the other. Whether radioactive monsters or The Walking Dead, or devils, or poltergeists, or alien invaders, the malefactors that populate these cinematic nightmares are fundamentally other than us. It is their otherness that raises our hackles, leaving us profoundly disturbed. But there's a way to press our sense of dread to still another level. What if the other, without in any way compromising its otherness, is to be found in the mirror? What is more disturbing than a Heimlich other? One of the strengths of fantasy is that it can concretize abstractions. In Kansas, Dorothy Gale can call Miss Gulch a wicked old witch, but it's just a figure of speech. But in the fantasy land of Oz, the unpleasant Miss Gulch can actually be one. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, William Faulkner said that the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. It's only in the fantasy trope, known as the Doppelgänger, that Faulkner's formula can be fully reified. If all you want is to make the cinematic equivalent of a roller coaster ride, then a movie about lizard men from the swamp will do. But if you want to make something more substantial, one way is to deal with the ancient lizard brain that still exists in all of us, tucked up under the neocortex that we're so proud of. Take that lizard brain, incarnate it through the idiom of fantasy, and make it the antagonist in a way that reminds us that it issues from ourselves, from within ourselves. And you'll have a cinematic nightmare that will continue to haunt the viewer long after the lights come up and the empty popcorn box is discarded. That's why the Doppelgänger theme is one of the important ways that horror films can strive to avoid being relegated to Theodore Sturgeon's 90% category. Over the decades, it has consistently proven to be a wellspring of inspiration for meaningful nightmare cinema. And I have no doubt that for decades to come, it will continue to provide fertile ground for those filmmakers who have chosen to be the cinema's midnight sharecroppers, sowing dread and raising goose flesh. All right, so at this point, let's make it more of a dialogue. If you have comments, I'll be happy to learn from them. If you have questions, I'll do my best to pretend to have an answer. Yes?
I really enjoyed what you had to say about Frankenstein and Dracula, and I was just wondering if you recognize, or if you think of the Doppelgänger as being the element that makes all of these spin-offs possible, where some of obviously the movies you don't see like Return of the Wizard 4 or something.
Right, right.
And so I guess I'm a new student to horror films, and so I'm trying to wrap my mind around, number one, what is this fascination that we have with Frankenstein and Dracula? I'm just wondering if it has something to do with the Doppelgänger.
It may well. I think my feeling is that the stories that endure within this genre and more broadly tend to be those that tap into, one way or another, tap into archetypes. There are these stories that go back centuries, and there's a reason for that. Because once you tap into one of these archetypes, and you start digging into it, you find that it's bottomless. And that's why we continue to tell these stories. You know, Beauty and the Beast. That's a story that's been told over and over and over in various ways. We dress it up differently. You know, it's the heart of King Kong. You know, and we know that that's not accidental. It's written right in the script of the original 1933 King Kong, the very end, where they say, you know, it's the airplanes that got Kong, and somebody says, no, it was Beauty that killed the beast. So it's right there in the script. We know it's intentional. But when a screenwriter taps into one of these archetypal stories, you know, Frankenstein, I think, taps into one of the archetypal stories going back to Icarus. It's about not only Frankenstein, but all the mad scientist type stories are about the sin of pride, you know, overreaching. And it goes right back to Icarus, which is one of those ancient archetypes. When you were lucky enough to tap into one of these archetypical stories, you've got a tiger by the tail, narrative blue speed. I think that explains it as much as anything. What else? Stunned you into silence. Yes, sorry.
This is a silly question, but what's your favorite horror movie?
Favorite horror movie?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah. Rather than one title, let me say, I suppose, the works of Val Lewton.
It's over there on the table.
Lewton was a producer who worked for RKO and did a whole series of really B movies. And he was given the titles. I mean, they said, all right, this is the title. And so the titles are ghastly. I mean, just, you know, The Leopard Man. I Walked with a Zombie. I just, you know, he didn't come up with the titles. He was given these titles for these, you know, cheap pot boilers. But instead of making a pot boiler, he did really interesting artistic work, working with, you know, top directors like Maurice Turner. And they're wonderful because he had very little budget. It was a B movie, all of them were. But he would use the viewer's imagination you know, there's a scene in one of them in which this little girl is sent out by her mother on some errand, and she's afraid to go, and the mother thinks she's being silly, and the mother, you know, just sort of locks her out. And then you hear this horrible commotion and this blood-curdling scream. It's a leopard out there, actually, is what it is. And then you see just this little trickle of blood into the door. It's a much cheaper way to shoot the scene, but also because it taps into your imagination, it's a much more vivid way to shoot the scene. So, you know, The Cat People is another one of his. Seventh Victim. I mean, there's a whole series of these really striking, remarkable films that he made for practically no money, and given, you know, these lurid titles that he was just handed, and coming up with something really creative out of that. It's an impressive achievement. And yeah, I saw it too. Yeah, Charles.
The character of that Frankenstein, from Rupert?
Yeah.
What is the idea about the winning horses? Or is that just Mel Brooks's take on it?
Yeah. It's you know, a cheap kind of way of that you find in some of the lesser films of this type that to try to infuse the scene with some drama that he picked up on and exaggerated. Although I must say, Young Frankenstein, Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein, is parody in the best sense, because good parody is always affectionate. It's not ridiculing the original. The best parody grows out of affection for the original, and Brooks certainly had great affection for the films that he was parodying in Young Frankenstein, even to the point of he actually went out and tracked down the guy who had designed the original lab equipment in The Bride of Frankenstein, a guy named Kenneth Strickfaden. And he had this stuff still in his garage, and he found it and, you know, paid him for the use of it, set it up, cleaned it up. So what you see in Young Frankenstein, much of it is the original laboratory equipment from The Bride of Frankenstein. You know, Mel Brooks knew these films very well, knew what he was parodying, and it's in the best tradition of parody.
So that whinnying never appears in the original film when she appears?
To my knowledge. To my knowledge, no.
Each time she appears in Young Frankenstein?
Yes.
And the thunder crashing?
Yeah. And it's a great device.
Is the storyline in Psycho kind of a variation on that Doppelgänger theme?
It is a variation. Yeah. Although that's getting more into real psychological conditions, which is one of the things that I sort of said I was going to sidestep. But what happens in Psycho is that it takes this fantasy tradition, brings it back to real life, so that, and really nails it down, because you've got that whole long scene after the climax of the story, where the psychiatrist at great length, you know, elaborates on, you know, what this guy's story is and why he's like this and all that sort of thing. So it's taking something that's drawn from a fantasy tradition and rooting it very firmly in real life, and in that way making it, in a sense, even more horrifying, because this is somebody that you could actually encounter in real life. So yes, so it is a variation, but variation in the sense of taking it out of the fantasy realm, grounding it in reality.
A film like Birds, is that because of our fear of snakes at some point, because birds sting? I mean, what's going on there?
Well, it's just, you know, nature out of control. You know, why shouldn't the birds. Just, you know, there are a lot more of them than there are of us. Why shouldn't they just wipe us out? Why don't they? You know, we've caged them for a long, long time. You know, what if, it's one of those what if questions that a lot of good fantasy is based on. What if they just, you know, got fed up and said, look, we're going to exploit our numeric superiority and just wipe you guys out.
Could you take this opportunity to plug the collection? And because of you and your marvelous suggestions, we have a wonderful collection.
Funny you should mention that. I was planning on that. Yes, right next door, there is an extraordinary treasure trove of cinema. Everything that I've talked about, referred to, is over there, and a lot more. Plunder it.
In a good way.
I turn up over there regularly like a bad penny. They don't seem to mind.
Oh my God.
And so, you know, yeah, I mean, it is an extraordinary collection. And not just, you know, in any one genre. It's a very broad-based, really extraordinary collection. So, yeah, absolutely take advantage of it by all means. Yes, good.
Has there been a film in the last few years that's really caught your eye as a good example of the doppelganger thing?
Wow. Nothing comes to mind in recent memory, but it's probably because I missed it. I'm sure it's out there. This is one of those stories that's going to keep being made. Variations on it, one way or another. But off the top of my head, nothing's coming to mind in recent year. Anybody think? I miss a lot these days too.
You don't miss it.
Or at least I stay, you know, months behind. I don't get out to the theaters as much as I used to. Having a nice basement screening room tempt you away from it.
Fans of Labyrinth?
You know, I still haven't seen that. Yeah, I bet you got it.
Step over.
One's on reserve.
I'll get around to it.